Hello and welcome everybody. This is International Master Sam Shankland, and today I would like to continue the series on the Queen's Gambit, and I'm going to go over the promised Ragozin variation and the DC4 line that I didn't go over last time. So start out with Bishop B4. So this is known as the Ragozin variation. Normally, like, Black will play a move like Bishop E7 here, as we saw. And this is a little bit more passive, and Bishop B4 is a little bit more active, so this sort of attracts more aggressive players. Although I think the position is much more theoretical, and there's a lot more memorizing of opening theory than understanding the position and learning the middle game. So there's a few key ideas for white. I'm only going to look at three moves here: CD5, Bishop G5, and Queen A4 check. So I'll start out with well, I guess Queen A4 check is sort of a subset of C takes D5. So white can, it's inaccurate to play Queen A4 check now, because after knight C6, C takes D5, actually all three recaptures for black are extremely interesting. So, I mean, even Queen takes D5 is, the queen is very well placed, still come to F5 or H5 later. And of course, the knight can't take it because of the pin to the king. But if white takes on D5 first, then black really has no business taking with anything other than the pawn. If knight takes Bishop D2, white will play E4 and have a big center. If queen takes, again, Bishop D2, and he gets a tempo that he otherwise would have played Queen A4 check, allowing black to develop. So black takes back with the E pawn. And now let's say Queen A4 check, knight C6, Bishop G5. And we get to sort of an interesting position. And I kind of like these to play this way for white, again, because it's less theoretical, and there's more life left in the position for people to come up with their own ideas. So the point is something like castles, E3, H6, Bishop F6, Queen F6, Bishop E2, Rook E8, castles, and now, okay, so knight takes D5 is threatened to something like Bishop E6. And now let's say Rook FC1. So we get to a middle game like this one. There's a ton of similar ones. And the plans for both sides are very interesting. White sort of is going to play with a minority attack, which is something we've already seen before. I should point out another way for black to play is to play Rook D8 in this position, with the idea after castles, Bishop F8, and he's protecting with the Rook. But okay, I'm going to go back to the one we just had for a second. I just forgot about that one temporarily. So castles, Bishop E6. So white's going to play for some kind of minority attack. Let's say Rook FC1, A6, because black wants to play Bishop D6 but doesn't want to have to worry about knight B5. And now, okay, a very common move for white here is to bring the queen back to D1. Because really D1 is a great square for the queen, but the problem is white's rook on F1 is bad then. So now that the rook has come over here, the queen can come back. And now white has ideas of playing moves like knight A4 to C5. So let's say knight E7, knight A4, and Bishop D6. We get a position like this one, and it's clear white's going to try to play moves like Rook B1, and play for B4 and B5. And black, on the other hand, is going to try to play moves like G5, knight G6, king G7, and start to attack. So for example, if G5 here, B4, maybe we don't want to allow B5 just yet, so black will play C6 first. Maybe now knight C5 for white, trying to of course, black doesn't want to take and open the B file and give up his good bishop. But then B7 is hanging. He doesn't really want to trade his E6 bishop, so Bishop C8, and now A4 with ideas of playing B5. Another thought here, always an idea when black plays G5. You have to ask yourself, why can black open up his king like this? And the answer is because the position is closed, the center is closed. So here, while normally it's sort of a mistake to open the position for a bishop pair, I think E4 is a very interesting idea, to try to open the position and take advantage of black weakening his king side. Of course, if Bishop C5, you don't want to take it immediately because then you lose E4, so you intermezzo with E5. And we have another very interesting position, but the center is a little bit more open, which makes black's king side play a little bit more dubious. But after E4, black could try something like bishop f4 maybe, hitting the rook. And now if e5, queen g6, he still has ideas of attacking on the king side. Something like knight f5 now. I don't know, maybe g3, g4, and position is very unclear, with good chances for both sides. So, actually here white's just winning because I forgot g4 is hanging. But, let's say g4 first. And now, I think position is probably just fine for black. It's really interesting though, but I'm a little bit skeptical of letting white play e4. So, black playing g5 right away probably doesn't make that much sense. So, then the question remains, what does he do? In the meantime, what does white do? Let's say black plays c6 to be solid. b4 and even bishop back to c8. Well, then actually maybe knight b6 is annoying. So how about rook d8? The idea now when the bishop comes back to c8, black's rook's a little more active. It's hard to see how white's going to improve his position as well. So he's going to want to play for a4, b5, but that's not so easy to achieve. For example, here after a4, black maybe plays a move like knight f5, and if b5 takes a5 might be annoying, because now this a pawn will be a very strong pawn, and black doesn't really have any pawn weaknesses. d5 is sort of a weakness, but not much of one. For example, if queen b3, b6, d5 pawn can't be taken yet because the knight, and if like knight a4, maybe bishop b8, which protects d5 and b6. And, okay, in a few moves, if white doesn't do something, black might end up with a better position if he plays knight d6 to c4 in some cases, and he does have the bishop pair, which are starting to look more active than they were before. So that would be very interesting. And basically, these are the main plans for black. Black will try to be solid, potentially attack on the king side. White's going to try to bring his queen back to d1, play on the queen side. In some cases, he'll play g3, bishop f1 to g2, and often the e4 break always comes to mind. So these are very positional games. There's not much opening theory. That's sort of what I like about them. And, but I'm going to go back to the more theoretical lines because I know those are important as well. So really, the two main theoretical lines are bishop g5 now and bishop g5 after taking on g5. So since we're just looking at cd5, I guess we'll do this again. Now bishop g5, knight d7, e3. So we get sort of a similar position to one we saw earlier in the Queen's Gambit declined, although black's bishop is on b4 rather than e7. And here, I think in the long term, white should be pretty happy because he has the plan of minority attack, and the bishop is probably misplaced on b4 in the long term. However, in the short term, black can create immediate play with a move like c5. It would be a mistake for black to castle. But here, after c5, queen a5 comes into play. For example, if a3 takes queen a5, suddenly white just looks to be in a load of trouble. All of black's pieces are getting very active. So the main move is bishop d3, and now queen a5. So rook c1 has been played here before, sacrificing the pawn on a2. Queen d2 has also been played, queen c2 has been played. I think queen c2 is the most popular move. And now black plays c4, getting space on the queen side. Bishop f5, castle, castle, g6, bishop h3. And we have a very interesting position now. One of the main ideas for black is to be able to take on c3 and play knight e4. So here I think basically white's plan is going to be eventually move this knight away and play f3, e4 and make a big pawn center, because that will really make black's little queen side play a little bit more skeptical. But black is trying to play on the queen side. He'll try to trade off this light squared bishop for his. And, you know, eventually, if, like, let's say rook c1, knight b6, the knight starts showing up on a4, white might have some issues. So something like takes, knight a4 is a threat. But after a4, it's not immediately clear how black's going to continue. He doesn't really want to trade on g5, but he might not have too much choice. If he plays more like rook e8, let's say bishop f4. White's plan is simple. He's going to move his knight and then play f3, e4. And black might have some issues if that happens. So white would be expanding in the center and potentially playing on the king side. And these are very interesting positions for sure. So going back, I'm going to sort of take a look at the other way for both sides to play. So, there's other ideas as well. One of them is for black to play h6 in this position. Now, this is much less sharp, and in my opinion, it's just not as good, because after bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, queen b3, black's starting to experience some problems. If bishop c3, queen c3, white's just a little bit better, because he's got this pawn in the minority attack. Black's a little bit undeveloped, and he traded the dark squared bishops, which often favors him. So really c5 is the main move here. And now e3, castle, and now strong move d takes c5. So a lot of moves have been played here, but of course if bishop c5 after knight d5, black is down a pawn, and white will quickly play bishop c4 and castle short, completely negating any and all compensation. So black usually plays bishop c3, queen c3 here, and says, okay, well, white's up a pawn, but his pawns are stupid, and now knight d7. But after rook d1, it seems white wins the pawn back on d5. So knight c5, rook d5, b6. And in this position, there's no question black has excellent drawing chances, because his pawn structure is much better, he's ahead in development, his bishop is probably going to end up better, but a simple head count should be enough to warn those playing black that there are definite dangers of losing this position. So, but okay, black does have some good drawing chances, and this has been played a few times by some very strong players, although really black almost never wins here. But if he sets up bishop e6, rook c8, knight a4, you know, it's a lot of pressure on white's queen side, and white's pawns don't seem too effective at the moment. So, but still, obviously anyone would probably prefer to be white there. There's other moves here too, like knight c6, but I don't think this really helps matters too much. Let's say rook d1 maybe. And now bishop e6, oh sorry, not rook d1. White plays a3 now. And it's a little strange to say, okay, well, why is black not fine? Obviously wasted tempo, but really, the move black played was knight c6, which was not something he wants to do. He wanted the knight to recapture on c5, but now that's just not going to happen, because the knight would have been better on d7. So I think, again, here, white's better. He has ideas of playing c4 and liquidating, and he'll just have an extra pawn if that happens. If black plays, let's say, bishop e6, rook b1 might be a problem, because this b pawn requires defense. Rook a b8, and let's say knight d4, and it's not losing for black, of course, but again, a head count. White's up a pawn and seems to have some pressure. So for that reason, I prefer the sharper lines for black, and I think he's mostly doing okay there. So with that in mind, I'm going to go on to bishop g5 first. So this gives the possibility of playing d takes c4, and that's a very interesting possibility as well. So I'm actually going to look at this through a different move order, which goes d takes c4 here, because this is the next main variation. So we're sort of done with the Ragozin for now. I don't know too much about it, but I gave basically the main plans. So now e4 and bishop b4, and we get to the same position. So, of course, white doesn't really want to take on c4, because then after knight takes e4, he really does remain down a pawn. So, plays bishop g5 here. And white's plan is to take this pawn on c4 and say, alright, I got a big center. Black could try h6, and then after some bishop f6, queen f6, bishop c4. White has a big center, but black has the bishop pair, which is sort of leads to sort of a balance. I think I'd prefer to be white, though. For example, c5, castles, this is very normal, c takes d4, and now a strong move e5, with the idea after queen d8 to play knight e4, and leave the black pawn on d4 for a little while. It's not really going to be an issue for white. I mean, he can almost always just put a bunch of rooks on the d file and scoop it up, but his idea is to gain space in the center and play against this bad piece on c8. So white will play rook d1, rook c1. It's a very interesting pawn sacrifice, and considering white can get the pawn back basically whenever, I'm not too worried about the lack of material. So that's definitely interesting. Although really the main move for black here is to play c5. Although b5 also needs to be considered. I actually was preparing for a game I played recently, and I saw my opponent played this move. And the point is defecting c4. So now a4, and okay, if white plays e5, many of you might be wondering with this pin after h6, I'm not sure what he's really achieved. Because if he retreats the bishop, this d5 square will be very nice for the black knight. He doesn't really want to trade on f6, because that lets black sort of attack his good center, which is what white's competition for the pawn was. And if bishop h4 and g5, and doesn't really help. So it's sort of like an improved version of the Botvinnik variation, because normally black would have this position with the pawn on c6 and the bishop still on f8, but here black will play c5 in one go and the bishop's well placed on b4. So going back, a4 is the main move. And now, okay, obviously a6 is what black would like to play, but if now ab5, rook a8 seems to win. So black normally will play bishop b7 here. And now takes. We have sort of an interesting position. It's funny, considering white has 3 isolated pawns and 2 of them are doubled isolated. I actually think white has the better pawn structure because black doesn't really have any means to attack those pawns, while his pawn on a7 requires constant defense, and white's ahead in development. For example, castle, white threatens knight e4. Black has to do something with bishop b7. Let's say white plays queen e2, rook f d1. He has ideas of playing d5, and I think white's a little bit more active and seems to have a pleasant position. So I'll go back to the main move is c5. So black's trying to counterattack in the center. Bishop c4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, queen a5. So this is his idea. He's now threatening bishop on g5, and the knight on c3, and the pawn on e4. So he's attacking lots of stuff. Now, it would be a mistake for white to take on e4, because after taking on c3, black looks really happy. But white plays bishop b5 check first. So now bishop d7, bishop takes f6. So bishop c3, bc3. Now, note that queen c3 would be a blunder. After king f1, gf6, rook c1, black can't stop rook c8. And bishop b5 similarly looks pretty bad after some knight b5, queen b5, bishop, or queen d8 mate. So black has to take on f6 here. And black's idea is he's compromised his king side a little bit, but his king will probably be not so poorly placed on e7, or maybe even castle and queen side. And in the meantime, white has seriously compromised his queen side pawn structure. And black seems to be doing all right on development. So bishop d7, knight d7, castle. And now we have an interesting position. Black doesn't really want to take on c3, because that lets white's pieces into the game after rook c1 and rook c7, or knight b5 to d6. So that's not really on black's agenda, but it's not easy to see what black really wants to do. So a6 is the main move. His idea is queen's going to come back to c7, which is a nice square, and then maybe he'll castle queenside. So rook b1, queen c7. And now I think if black can castle queenside and play knight c5, he's probably just better, because he's got a very solid position and white's pawns are all very vulnerable. So white sort of has to prevent that. And the main thing he does here is queen h5. So his idea is now, of course, queen takes f7 happens if castle's won, and then black loses a bunch of pawns in the game. And knight takes e6 is threatened. Note that queen e5 looks very natural, offering a queen trade. And if queen e5, fe5, white doesn't have time to take b7, because d4 hangs. But here, actually, white can actually still take on e6, which is kind of funny, because after queen takes h5, knight g7, white's in the driver's seat, winning a pawn in the game. So knight c5 is played, but now, again, if black can castle queenside, he'll be very happy. So white plays rook b4, which is a strong move, intending to meet castles along with rook c4, which would probably just win. Third b6, knight b3. So black can't really castle yet, and we sort of have a pretty typical position for this variation. Black's very solid, but his king's a little bit exposed, and, you know, white's pretty active, so I'd prefer to be white. I'm going to just briefly show another game I saw that went like so, rook fd1. And this was a game from a couple of players that I met at the World Youth Chess Championships. One of my co-champions, or actually both of them were my opponents. And Black basically grabbed a pawn and paid the price. So I think going back, that game went a little differently. King e7 here. And then rook b1, queen c7, queen h5. And no, sorry, I'm stupid. It went like a6, and white played f4 now, which is an interesting move. Normally rook fd1 is played, but f4 is very strong, trying to quickly open lines on the king side. So black took the bait with queen takes on c3, hitting the knight, and this was skeptical at best. So game continues, rook fd1, and now black played rook ag8, or sorry, rook hg8, and after knight takes e6, he found himself completely lost. So white could have maybe tried taking b7, but somehow I wasn't as thrilled about this prospect, something like this, and now queen takes e4, hitting the rook, and g2, and I wasn't so sure if this was actually that good for white. So it probably is fine, but knight takes e6 really ends matters. So if f takes e6, queen takes h7, and as played in the game, king takes e6, queen f5 check here, check here, and queen d5 threatening mate. And if rook f8, queen d6 is mate on e7. So nice game by white. Okay, normally it's not going to be that easy, but I think on the whole, white is often doing quite well in this line. So that was it for this one on the sort of the sharper queen's gambits of queens positions. So until next time, this is Sam Shanklin signing off.